The byproducts of man's industrial development have created one of the most serious problems facing civilization. Every day, a variety of chemical agents are released into the atmosphere. Chemical agents that create serious problems for human life, animals, property, and plant life. The pollutants you can see, although obnoxious and offensive to the nose and sight, are not as dangerous to plant life as the invisible gases coming out of the stacks at the same time. The gray-colored fly ash you see deposited on these leaves comes from a coal-burning power plant. Visible pollutants such as fly ash and other particulates detract from the appearance of the plant and reduce the amount of light absorbed by the leaves. The fly ash was rubbed from pine needles on the left. The invisible gases emitted into the atmosphere are much more dangerous than visible particulates to most species of plant life. Without controls, chemical agents attack plant life in ways that can reduce growth and result in yield loss, produce a damaging appearance, and ultimately threaten the very existence of vegetation. This film will acquaint you with some of the major pollutants and show you examples of vegetation injury caused by each. The amount of air pollution injury to vegetation varies with the concentration of pollutants in the air and the amount of time plant life is exposed. If vegetation is exposed to a high level of pollutant over a short period of time, it may suffer acute injury. Exposure to lower levels over a long period can cause chronic injury. Various plant species differ in susceptibility to air pollution injury. This mixed stand several miles from a source of pollution shows the difference in susceptibility among species. Susceptibility also may differ within a particular species. Here, a stand of Virginia pine exposed to sulfur dioxide from a coal-burning source contains trees that show little or no injury to those with severe injury, stunting and extensive needle burn. This tree shows little signs of injury. This one shows signs of being moderately susceptible. And this one shows signs of severe susceptibility. This stand of loblolly pine, also exposed to sulfur dioxide, again shows the difference in susceptibility within a species to injury from air pollution. Tip burn like this results from tissue death and causes reduction in photosynthesis and food production, limiting future growth. Injury can occur at great distances from a source of pollution. Acute injury due to sulfur dioxide exposure occurred to a number of plant species more than 5 miles from the source. Black oak, white ash, hickory, dwarf sumac, blackberry, farkleberry, and blackjack oak. One of the earliest agents associated with pollution, sulfur dioxide, is created by the combustion of fossil fuels. Field crops and other plant life are also susceptible to sulfur dioxide. The light tan necrosis is typical of sulfur dioxide injury on corn. The injury you see occurred 5½ miles from a plant spewing invisible quantities of sulfur dioxide. Corn is affected in varying degrees in the same field. The necrotic streaking on the lower leaves of corn in the area may also be due to sulfur dioxide. Additional research is needed to substantiate the cause of this condition. Potato plants in the same area display white and tan leaf necrosis. The holes were created when dead tissue fell away. Many native weed species are also injured by sulfur dioxide. Therefore, sensitive species can be used as indicators of toxic levels of sulfur dioxide. Smartweed, common in many areas of the United States, shows varying degrees of leaf necrosis when exposed. Here, giant ragweed also shows typical sulfur dioxide injury from exposure. Cinnamon fern shows light brown necrotic areas. Evidence of sulfur dioxide injury on Small's ragwort shows up as irregular brown necrotic areas. Lespedeza, often grown as a forage crop, is another indicator of sulfur dioxide emissions. Another invisible pollutant discharged into the atmosphere, uncontrolled. Small amounts of hydrogen fluoride can be harmful to vegetation. You cannot see the fluoride being discharged into the atmosphere from these stacks. What you see are particulates. The fluoride, which is harmful, is invisible. Hidden by trees in the foreground, a metal reduction plant discharges pollutants, including hydrogen fluoride, into the atmosphere. Carried on the wind, the chemical agents released affect neighboring plant life. The trees on this hillside have suffered. Many have died, probably from exposure to fluoride. When toxic levels of fluoride are absorbed by plant tissues, a variety of symptoms result. One of the classical symptoms of fluoride injury in the southeast is marginal chlorosis of citrus leaves. Notice how the yellowed tissue contrasts with the green area along the veins. Long-term exposure to elevated levels of fluoride caused this chronic injury to citrus leaves. In other areas, fluorides may also produce marginal chlorosis. Marginal chlorosis shows up here on sugar maple and rhododendron. Cottonwood near fluoride sources displays both marginal chlorosis and interveinal chlorosis. Other species show interveinal chlorosis and necrosis, such as red maple, sassafras, black oak. Some species, such as poison ivy, show a pigmentation change which would not be expected in midsummer. Exposed to fluoride released a quarter of a mile away, shingle oak shows a downward cupping of leaves with irregular necrotic areas. Sumac displays a marginal and interveinal necrosis. The tips of the blades of cattails were killed when continually exposed to elevated levels of fluoride. White pine needles show varying amounts of tip burn after exposure. These symptoms in your area may indicate the presence of fluoride in the air. An investigation of the possible pollutant sources and knowledge of pollutant levels is needed for a more accurate diagnosis. In the area where fluoride symptoms were present, leaf analysis revealed levels of from 100 to 300 parts per million in leaves displaying symptoms. These levels are much higher than the 5 to 15 parts per million which would be found in geographical areas away from fluoride sources. When animal forage contains 35 or more parts per million of fluoride, cattle grazing continuously on this forage may develop skeletal deformities and may eventually die if forage levels stay above 60 parts per million. This is photochemical pollution, becoming an increasingly common phenomenon in many urban areas. Photochemical pollution begins when the products of fossil fuel combustion are released into the atmosphere. A photochemical reaction through the energy of sunlight can result in phytotoxic concentrations of photochemical oxidants. One of the most important of these is ozone. Another is called peroxyacetyl nitrate, commonly called PAN. Both can be injurious to a variety of species of plant life. This is Lake Arrowhead, California, in the San Bernardino Mountains, a resort area 75 miles east of Los Angeles. Its lakes, cool climate, and trees are its main attractions. But for how long? Property values and recreation are threatened by destruction of ponderosa pine and other coniferous species. The cause? Photochemical oxidants. Research to date indicates that ozone is the major cause of plant injury in this area, but other elements of the photochemical complex may be involved. Symptoms of oxidant injury on ponderosa pine include premature death of needles. The second-year needles on this ponderosa pine have already died, and many have dropped. The current-year needles show an irregular chlorotic mottling. As with other pollutants, individual members of a species can vary in susceptibility when exposed to oxidants. The pine tree you see on the right is relatively resistant. The one on the left is susceptible. Christmas tree plantations 50 miles from an urban center are also suffering from photochemical pollution. This stand of Monterey pine shows premature death of second-year needles and chlorosis and necrosis of current-year needles. The stipple and early leaf senescence you see on these grape leaves was one of the first symptoms associated with the effects of photochemical oxidants on vegetation. Oxidants reduce the grape plant's ability to photosynthesize food, thereby reducing grape yields. Okra in areas where oxidants are a problem also displays stippling of the leaves. Extensive plantings of celery often are exposed to toxic levels of oxidant pollutants. Most of the lower celery leaves show symptoms of ozone injury, white intervenal necrosis. Corn growing in the same area also shows necrosis. Field observations revealed that photochemical pollution has apparently reduced corn yield by affecting pollination, thereby reducing the number of normally developed kernels. Although, as with most crops, the extent of economic loss is not yet known, growth and yield of alfalfa is reduced by photochemical oxidants, which cause premature leaf drop and these symptoms. Onions display premature tip dieback as a result of exposure to oxidant pollution. Ozone symptoms on citrus may show up as white necrotic flecking. Mallow or cheeseweed indicates the presence of phytotoxic levels of photochemical oxidants. Necrotic spotting on lamb's quarters, a weed found in many areas, is a good indicator of phytotoxic levels of oxidants. The pigmentation and undersurface glazing of this prickly lettuce indicates that phytotoxic levels of PAN have been present. Romaine lettuce is a vegetable very sensitive to PAN. It exhibits undersurface glazing and necrotic areas. Barley exposed to photochemical oxidants displays necrosis in areas of the leaf which were susceptible during exposure. Experimental laboratory exposures indicate PAN produced this symptom. In addition to farm crops, photochemical oxidants also injure plants grown in residential gardens. The petunias on the left, grown in non-filtered air, were injured by photochemical pollution. Those on the right were grown in filtered air and were not injured. Light-colored necrotic areas show up on exposed plants. Photochemical pollution is not limited to one geographic area. In the eastern half of the United States, one of the early reports of vegetation injury from photochemical oxidants was on tobacco leaves. When first reported, it was called weather fleck. Research revealed the injury was caused by the ozone component in photochemical pollution, which is becoming increasingly prevalent in the eastern United States, where much of our tobacco is grown. Besides affecting the quality of the tobacco, the symptoms remain after leaves are cured, making the leaves unsuitable for use as cigar wrappers. Even plants grown in an unfiltered greenhouse show injury from photochemical oxidant pollutants in our atmosphere. These petunias display an oxidant type of injury. A purplish stipple appears on these field-grown lima beans exposed to oxidant pollution. In greenhouse experiments with plants grown in filtered and unfiltered air, only those grown in unfiltered air showed symptoms of injury due to pollution. The sweet gum trees on the right, exposed to oxidants, show a marked change in leaf pigmentation. The corn leaf on the right, grown in unfiltered air, shows longitudinal flecking. The euphorbia plant on the right, grown in unfiltered air, is stunted, and its leaves have fallen prematurely. Another form of air pollution, not widespread but nevertheless potentially damaging, can be caused by an accidental spill of chemicals toxic to plants. These scenes resulted when a chemical tank truck accidentally overturned in June 1969, spilling anhydrous ammonia. Nearly every form of vegetation was severely injured and, in some cases, killed within a half-mile downwind when the wind carried the ammonia over the countryside. The surviving plants may recover and produce a crop, but growth and yield will surely be reduced. In this garden, a quarter of a mile away from the spill, most of the vegetation was injured. Here's what ammonia injury looked like on tomatoes, table beets, and cabbage. Occasionally, pollutants in the atmosphere will chemically react with the moisture in the atmosphere to form new chemical compounds injurious to plant life. These spots on the black cherry leaf were thought to be the result of nitric or sulfuric acid droplets that accumulated on the leaves. The same symptoms appeared on other species in the same area, such as post oak. This stand of dead loblolly pine trees was killed by air pollution. What specific pollutant caused it? Because sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, and photochemical oxidants are all present in the atmosphere of the area, the exact cause is not easily determined. The same is true here. At this point in time, we don't really know what toxic compounds from this paper mill caused this injury to a once wooded hillside. You have seen a sampling of some of the visual effects on plants caused by air pollutants. Little is known of the economic effects of pollution on growth and yield of plant species. Little is known of the subtle long-range effects on nature and our planet's complex ecological system. With time and additional research, we will have more answers. One thing is for certain, this waste of plant life must be avoided. The extreme example of plant life destruction you see below began over 70 years ago on the sides of the mountains facing this smelting plant, using ore with a high sulfur content. Although sulfur dioxide emissions from this smelter were reduced in the early 1900s, the effects wrought on the countryside by the early emissions still persist, partially due to continuing emission. Soil erosion seen below resulted when plants were killed by sulfur dioxide. We cannot permit air pollution to further endanger the delicate balance of our environment.
The history of animal life on the Earth stretches back for hundreds of millions of years. And during that long period, many different kinds of animals have developed, with many variations in size and shape and patterns of behavior. Each kind of animal is suited for a specific way of life in a specific kind of place. These special characteristics are called adaptations. Nearly all animals are adapted for movement in certain ways. Some animals have adaptations that help them to move in water. The jellyfish is one of the simplest forms of animal life. It swims by using a layer of muscle tissue to pump water into its hollow body and then force the water out again in a kind of jet propulsion. Actually, a jellyfish is not really a fish at all. Real fish are much more complicated animals, and a fish has several adaptations for swimming. The bodies of most fish are streamlined, and the skin is covered by a slippery substance. This slippery covering lets water slide easily over the fish's body with very little friction. The large tail fin is used to push the fish through the water, and the smaller fins are adapted for steering and maintaining balance. Other animals are adapted for movement on land, and most of these animals have legs. Each type of land animal has its own characteristic way of moving, because its legs are adapted for its own specific habitat and way of life. Some animals spend much of their time in the trees, and their body structure is adapted for climbing. The feet of an opossum are well suited for grasping the branches and twigs of a tree, and its tail is also useful in climbing. Some land animals are adapted for moving without legs. A snake has a long, flexible backbone, which makes it possible for the snake to bend its body into curves. By pushing against the outside of each curve, the snake is able to move its body forward. So there are several adaptations that help different kinds of animals to move on land. And there are other adaptations that help some animals to move in the air. Most adult insects have wings, as well as legs, and their wings give them an important advantage. By flying instead of moving on land, these insects can cover a much larger territory as they search for food. Birds have much more complicated bodies than insects, and the body of a bird has several adaptations for flying. A bird has a large breastbone that provides a place for the attachment of the powerful muscles that move the wings. Birds are the only animals with feathers, and feathers are a very efficient adaptation for flying. Feathers are very light in weight, but the wing feathers are still firm and strong, forming a broad surface that helps to push the bird through the air. These adaptations give nearly all birds the ability to fly, but birds are adapted for other kinds of movement as well. All birds have legs, and they can move around on land. And some birds, including geese, as well as ducks and swans, are also adapted for swimming. These birds have webbed feet, which they use as paddles. Webbed feet are also found on other kinds of swimming animals, like the beaver. Beavers are able to move easily both in the water and on land. So there are several different adaptations for different kinds of movement. But an animal must also be adapted in other ways to survive in its environment. Some animals have special adaptations for life in a particular climate region. In the hot, dry climate of the desert, a camel can live for several days without food or water. The hump stores food in the form of fat, and water is stored in several extensions of the stomach. Camels are now found only in the deserts of Africa and Asia, but several other animal species live in the deserts of North America. During the hottest part of the day, these animals usually stay underground, in the burrows they've dug to protect themselves from the heat. Most of them, like this pack rat, are small and can live on very little food. This kit fox has another adaptation that's typical of many desert animals. The large ears form a broad surface that gives off excess body heat into the air. Large eyes are also an advantage for a desert animal, like this ringtail, a relative of the raccoon. A ringtail can see very well at night. It rests underground during the day, and then at about sunset, it leaves its burrow. It searches for food at night, when the desert air and sand are cooler. In the temperate climate region, the approach of winter brings a major change in the environment, and the animals living here have adaptations that help them to survive the change of seasons. Many birds escape from the cold temperatures by migrating to a warmer climate. The birds that remain grow additional feathers, and this covering of feathers provides very effective insulation against the cold. Mammals are insulated in winter by growing a heavier coat of fur. There are many other adaptations that help certain animals to stay alive in winter. At the bottom of a pond, a frog survives in a dormant or inactive state. Its heartbeat and other life processes have slowed to a minimum, and its body temperature has fallen almost to the freezing point. Many insects are not able to survive cold weather, but they leave their eggs behind in a sheltered place. Under this small bump on a tree are insect eggs that will hatch when the weather becomes warmer. A cocoon provides shelter for another type of insect. Inside this cocoon, a caterpillar will change into an adult moth. Under the snow, a layer of soil protects an ant colony from freezing temperatures. It's warm enough here for the ants to stay active all winter. Gradually the days grow warmer, and a new cycle of life begins. Many young animals, like these baby rabbits, are born in springtime when food becomes more plentiful. So many animals are adapted for the special conditions of a certain climate region. But wherever an animal lives, it must also be adapted for eating certain kinds of food. Animals are adapted for eating plant food. A cardinal uses its short, heavy beak for cracking hard seeds. And a hummingbird has a long, thin beak adapted for sucking nectar from the flower of a plant. A grasshopper has a complex set of mouth parts that can rapidly chew a leaf. Almost all mammals have teeth, and their teeth are adapted for eating certain kinds of food. Mammals with hoofs have flat teeth, used for grinding grass and leaves. Other animals are adapted for eating meat. Hawks and other birds of prey have sharp hooked beaks that are well adapted for tearing meat. The feet of these birds have sharp talons used to capture prey. There are many animals that feed on both plant and animal food. Bears are well adapted for capturing and eating other animals, but a bear will also eat grass, fruit, and other kinds of plant food. Animals that eat several different kinds of food can change their diets during the year, depending on which type of food is most plentiful. Large, powerful animals like the bear are in no danger of being captured and eaten by other animals. But for many animals, survival depends on adaptations that can protect them from predators. A porcupine has a body covering of sharp quills that can easily puncture the skin of an animal that attacks the porcupine. The color and pattern of an animal's markings can also provide protection. The coloring of a female bobolink closely matches the vegetation around her nest. That helps to protect the young as well as the mother. But the male bobolink is not camouflaged, and his coloring can help to draw attention away from the nest. There are some animals that change their color as the seasons change. In winter, a snowshoe rabbit matches the snow, but as winter comes to an end, this white fur will gradually be replaced with brown fur that matches the surroundings in summer. Another adaptation for protection is a rapid reproductive cycle. These newborn mice will become fully adult within 6 weeks. Mice and other rodents, including squirrels and chipmunks, are killed in large numbers by predators, but their large birth rate and rapid life cycle make it likely that some of them will survive to become parents. Some other animals also find safety in numbers. Hoofed animals of many species live in large herds, and they protect their young by keeping them in the center of the herd. And because hoofs are well adapted for running, the healthy members of the herd can usually escape from a predator. And so, these healthy animals will survive to become the parents of a new generation. That's important, not only for these animals, but for the meat-eating animals as well, because it helps to make sure that both kinds of animals will be able to find enough food. The meat-eating animals could not survive if they were to kill off all of the animals that they use for food. And if some of these animals were not killed and eaten, their total numbers would become too large for their food supply. So the adaptations of animals work together to help preserve the balance of nature. Each kind of animal life has certain advantages that help it to survive, because each kind is adapted for a specific way of life within a specific environment.